If someone told you a house cat could raise 2 tiger cubs, you'd laugh or worry they'd lost their mind. But in a forgotten patch of Kentucky farmland, that's exactly what happened. And no one, least of all Walter Hayes, could have predicted how deeply it would change him. Walter wasn't looking to save anything. At 74, he was just trying to survive each day without his son, Mark, who had died 2 years earlier in a car crash on I-65. The grief had calcified in his chest, making every morning feel like a task. The farm, once filled with tractors humming and laughter over morning coffee, now stood quiet. Even the horses had been sold off. Walter lived alone with Mabel, a quiet old house cat that had belonged to Mark since he was a boy. Most days, Walter sat on the back porch with a blanket over his knees, staring out at the line of trees his son used to race dirt bikes through. Sometimes, Mabel would sit with him, curling her body against his leg, like she was trying to hold him together. That cat had seen more tears than any person in Walter's life. One overcast morning, while pouring feed for the chickens he'd kept out of habit, Walter heard something strange coming from behind the barn, faint high-pitched cries, sharp against the silence. He figured maybe a fox had gotten caught in the wire fence again. With a sigh, he grabbed his gloves and headed out back, expecting trouble. But what he found wasn't a fox, or anything close. Tucked beneath a sagging pile of straw were 2 small creatures, striped and trembling. At first, he thought someone had dumped tabby kittens, but as he inched closer, the stripes darkened, and the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. These weren't kittens, they were tiger cubs, tiny, wide-eyed, and alone. Walter stepped back in disbelief. Tigers here, in Kentucky. He looked around, expecting someone with a truck or a trailer to appear. But the fields were empty, and the cubs were barely breathing. He had no idea how they got there. Maybe some backwoods breeder had ditched them, or someone transporting exotic animals lost control. Whatever the reason, they were here now, squirming in the hay, making small mewling sounds, like they were calling for something, or someone. Walter hesitated. Logic said to call animal control. But his heart, that quiet, cracked thing, told him something else. He didn't know why, but he scooped them up. Maybe it was the way their fur felt warm and helpless. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't held anything so fragile since Mark was a baby. He carried them back toward the house, unsure of what the next hour, let alone the next day, would bring. Mabel met him at the porch, tail twitching, eyes locked on the bundle in his arms. Walter placed the cubs gently on an old quilt by the wood stove, hoping to warm them up. Mabel crept closer, sniffed once, then curled her body around the cubs like it was the most natural thing in the world. Walter stared, stunned. He expected hissing or retreat. But instead, the old house cat began to purr, a low, steady rhythm that filled the quiet room. He sat down slowly, watching the impossible unfold. The tiger cubs, barely bigger than squirrels, wriggled closer to Mabel's warmth. One of them let out a sigh, like a child safe in its mother's arms. Walter couldn't look away. It felt like the air had shifted, like something ancient had stepped into the room. For the first time in months, he felt something stir in his chest that wasn't just pain. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he couldn't look at those cubs, or Mabel, the same way again. The next morning, he called the local vet, half expecting to be laughed off the phone. But Dr. Evelyn Grant didn't laugh. She came right away. Her expression tightened when she saw the cubs, and she asked Walter 3 times if he'd really found them on his property. He nodded each time, and she finally knelt beside Mabel, who still hadn't moved. "She's taken them in," Evelyn said softly. This isn't normal, Walter. He knew that, but it was happening, and he wasn't about to stop it. That night, as rain tapped gently on the tin roof, Walter sat in his recliner. Mabel and the cubs curled together in the glow of the fire. He didn't turn on the TV, he didn't reach for his medication. He just listened to the quiet breathing of 3 creatures who shouldn't have found each other, but somehow did. And in that stillness, he began to wonder. Maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe some stories start in the middle of grief and grow from there. You won't believe how this story ends. It's the kind of twist that hits you when you least expect it, and stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Even the toughest hearts will feel a crack when they realize what really happened between an old man, a dying farm cat, and 2 tiger cubs who never should have survived. Because what started as a quiet act of compassion turned into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. Walter never meant to break the rules. He was just trying to keep them warm. But sometimes, when you open your heart, the world pushes back harder than you imagined. And soon, those tigers wouldn't just change Walter's days, they'd force him to make a choice that would test everything he had left. The first signs came just 4 days after the cubs arrived. Mabel, ever the quiet shadow, had stopped eating. At first, Walter thought it was stress. Maybe the cubs were too much for her. But when her breathing grew shallow and she didn't lift her head to greet him that morning, he felt a cold fear bloom in his chest. Dr. Grant came again, frowning deeply as she examined the cat on the blanket. "She's not sick," she said softly. "She's old, Walter. Her body's just giving out." He nodded, but inside, he was breaking. She'd held his son's hand when he was a boy. Now, she was giving everything she had to wild creatures she didn't even know. Meanwhile, the tiger cubs were growing fast. Their hunger seemed endless. Walter had to learn how to blend formula by hand, measuring out ounces while they pawed and cried. One of them, the slightly smaller female, had trouble keeping food down. Walter stayed up with her night after night, rubbing her belly with a warm cloth, the way Evelyn showed him. "Like a mother would," she said. And that's what he became, not just a caretaker, but a stand-in for something lost. Each day that passed, their bond deepened, even as the stakes grew heavier. Because with every pound they gained, the more they became what they truly were, predators. Neighbors started asking questions. One afternoon, a man from the feed store leaned over Walter's porch railing and said, "Heard you got some strange pets, Walt?" The tone wasn't friendly. Walter laughed it off, but inside, he was rattled. He knew it couldn't last. Exotic animals were illegal without permits. And if word got out, the authorities would come not with sympathy, but with cages, worse, tranquilizers, maybe bullets. He couldn't let that happen, but he also couldn't give them up, not after what they'd all been through. Not while Mabel was slipping away, curled beside them as if she knew her time was almost done. One night, after burying Mabel beneath the old oak tree where Mark used to tie his swing, Walter sat on the porch, cradling a crying cub in his arms. The weight of everything, the loss, the law, the loneliness, pressed down so hard he could barely breathe. He looked out into the night and said aloud, "What the hell am I doing?" The cub whimpered and nuzzled his neck, and in that moment, he knew. He wasn't just keeping them safe. They were keeping him from disappearing completely. The pressure finally cracked when someone left an anonymous tip. 2 weeks later, a white SUV pulled up the gravel road. "Fish and Wildlife?" The officer knocked politely, but his badge said otherwise. Walter stalled him as long as he could, offering coffee, playing the old man card, but the man was firm. "Sir, we need to see the animals." Walter stood frozen in the doorway, heart thudding. In the other room, the cubs were asleep on a pile of old towels, unaware that the world outside was sharpening its claws. He let the man in. What else could he do? But something happened then. The officer paused at the sight of the cubs, not with anger, not even with fear, with awe. "They think she's their mother," he asked, gesturing to the framed photo of Mabel on the mantel. Walter nodded. The man crouched beside the tigers, watching as one of them stirred and blinked slowly at him. "They're calm," he said quietly, "like house cats." For a second, Walter thought there might be hope, but then the radio on the officer's shoulder crackled. Backup orders, regulations. Walter had one night, that's what the man gave him. "You didn't hear it from me," he said as he left. "But tomorrow, they'll come, and they won't be as gentle." Walter didn't sleep. He paced the floor, eyes on the cubs, heart torn in pieces. He could run, try to hide them, but deep down, he knew what he had to do. It wasn't about keeping them, it was about saving them. He picked up the phone and called someone he never thought he'd call again, Mark's old friend from Wildlife Rescue. The one he hadn't spoken to since the funeral. He couldn't walk away anymore. The next 24 hours would decide everything, and Walter had no idea just how far this act of love would go or what it would cost. The old red pickup pulled into the driveway just before dawn, its headlights cutting across the fog like knives through memory. Behind the wheel was Caleb Renshaw, tall, weathered, and quiet, with the kind of steady hands that once helped Mark Hayes splint a broken foal's leg in the middle of a thunderstorm. Walter hadn't seen him in over a decade, not since Mark's funeral, when grief was so thick between them that not even shared sorrow could pull them into the same space. But when Walter called the night before, Caleb didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'll be there before sunup," and he was. The cubs were still asleep when Caleb stepped into the living room. He didn't speak at first, just knelt beside them, letting his fingers hover over their striped backs without touching. "They trust you," he said finally. Walter only nodded. There wasn't much left to say. Caleb opened his bag and began checking them. Weight, temperature, responsiveness. He moved with practiced precision, but Walter could see the tension in his jaw. "They're not just surviving," Caleb muttered, "they're thriving. But you know this can't hold." Walter did know that didn't make it easier. They sat at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Caleb pulled out a printed map and pointed to a sanctuary in Tennessee, a facility that specialized in large exotic rescues. Not a zoo, not a cage. Acres of protected woodland where the cubs could grow safely. "They'll be okay there," he said. "They won't be pets, but they won't be trophies either." Walter stared at the map, eyes burning. The thought of saying goodbye felt unbearable. But then he thought of Mark, of how his son always talked about second chances, especially for the wild, the broken, the misunderstood. Outside, the sun had started to rise, casting soft gold light across the porch where Mabel used to sleep. Walter stepped out, the cold morning air pinching his skin. One of the cubs had followed him, its oversized paws padding awkwardly along the wooden boards. It sat beside him, blinking up at the sky like it was waiting for something. Walter rested his hand on its back and whispered, "It's time, isn't it?" The cub leaned into him gently. In that moment, he felt both the weight of loss and the strange, fierce grace of letting go. They left just after 7 a.m. No lights, no noise. Caleb had arranged everything. A crate lined with soft blankets, secure and dark so the cubs wouldn't panic. Walter stood by the truck as Caleb gently placed each cub inside. One of them looked back, not with fear, but with recognition. Like it knew this wasn't the end, just the next chapter. Walter reached in, touched its paw. "You take care of each other," he said. And then the door closed. As the truck pulled down the gravel road, Walter felt his knees give, but he didn't fall. He stood there, hands shaking, as the taillights disappeared into the morning mist. The next few days were brutally quiet. The house felt too big again, the silence too deep, but something had shifted. The grief hadn't left, but it no longer screamed. It whispered now. Walter still made 2 extra bottles of formula every morning, out of habit. He still caught himself looking toward the fireplace, half expecting to see Mabel and the cubs curled up in that tangle of stripes and fur. And yet, he didn't feel empty, just open. Like the wound inside him had begun to heal in ways he didn't yet understand. Then the call came. Caleb's voice on the other end, low and steady. "They made it. Both of them. Vet says they're doing great. They've started eating on their own." Walter didn't speak, couldn't. Caleb went on, softer now. "The staff. They're calling them May and Buddy. Thought you should know?" Walter pressed the phone to his chest, eyes shut tight. It was such a small thing. Names, but it meant they weren't just animals anymore. They were beings, loved, remembered. That's all he ever wanted for them. A week later, a padded envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a photo, the cubs, bigger now, tumbling through tall grass, eyes bright and alive. Behind them, forest stretched wide and wild. On the back of the photo, a note in Caleb's handwriting, "They still nap curled into each other," like she taught them. Walter smiled for the first time in a long time. It was real. All of it. The pain, the bond, the choice. And somehow, through it all, something had bloomed where only loss had lived. That night, Walter placed the photo beside the framed picture of Mark and the small wooden box where Mabel's ashes now rested. The house was still quiet, still lonely, but it no longer felt empty because something had come through those walls, wild, impossible, and fiercely alive, and it had changed him. Not just the man who lost a son, but the man who found a reason to open his heart again. Spring returned to the Kentucky farm like it always did, slow and quiet, creeping through the trees and pushing green back into the fields. But this year, something felt different. Walter woke up early again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He started walking the perimeter of the property every morning with a thermos of coffee in hand, Mabel's old collar tucked in his coat pocket like a good luck charm. The silence that once haunted him now felt like peace. And even though the house was still just his, he no longer felt alone inside it. He had taken to writing letters, real, handwritten ones, to the sanctuary in Tennessee every other week. Sometimes he sent stories about the farm, other times just questions. Are they playing more? Has Buddy learned to swim yet? Is May still the smaller one? And every time, they wrote back photos, updates, even short videos burned onto little flash drives. He watched them on an old laptop, leaning close, smiling through tears as two not-so-little tigers bounded through tall grass like they owned the world. And in a way, they did. What Walter didn't expect was how the town started paying attention. It began with Evelyn, the vet, sharing the story, not names, just the facts. During a local seminar about animal compassion, then someone from the paper called Anne, then a local wildlife group. By summer, Walter found himself standing at the community center, telling a room full of retirees and kids about the day 2 tiger cubs and an old cat taught him how to live again. No dramatic speeches, just the truth. And it was enough to make people listen. He didn't sugarcoat it. He talked about the grief, the fear of doing the wrong thing, the legal gray area he'd wandered into. But he also talked about Mabel, how she took in the cubs without hesitation, how she never once acted like they didn't belong. She knew something I didn't, Walter said one evening, voice cracking just slightly. She didn't see danger, she saw need, and she answered it. The audience was silent, many with tears in their eyes. One woman came up afterward and pressed his hand. I lost my husband last year, she whispered. I think I needed to hear that. That summer, Walter did something he never thought he would. He reopened a part of the barn and turned it into a small education space. Just a few photos, some informational posters, and a short video loop of May and Buddy in their new home. He called it the Mabel Room. Kids came with school groups. Locals stopped by on weekends. People brought donations, questions, and sometimes their own stories of loss. It wasn't much, but it gave Walter purpose. A quiet mission to honor the love that had saved him. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit out under the stars with the sanctuary video playing on his tablet. May would chase shadows. Buddy would flop in the grass. They were growing fast, too fast. Walter knew he might not live to see them fully grown, but that didn't sadden him. He'd already seen the best part, their survival, their bond. The way they carried a piece of Mabel with them into the wild. That was more than enough. One autumn afternoon, Walter received a package from the sanctuary. Inside was a carved wooden plaque in honor of Mabel, the first mother. They'd placed it near the enclosure gate, where visitors could see it as they passed. Beneath it, a photo of the orange tabby curled between two baby tigers. Walter held it in his hands for a long time. Then he hung it by the fireplace, where her bed used to be, not as a monument to loss, but to love. When Walter passed just 2 days before his 76th birthday, he left behind a will that surprised everyone. A donation to the sanctuary, a trust for the continued upkeep of the Mabel Room, and one last request, that some of his ashes be scattered near May and Buddy's enclosure, where the plaque stood. His family honored every word. At the ceremony, the staff shared stories of how the cubs, now nearly full-grown, would pause by the plaque as if waiting, like they knew. In the end, Walter didn't just save 2 tigers, and he didn't just mourn a cat. He built something lasting out of grief, something wild, beautiful, and healing. What he lost could never be replaced, but what he gave, and what he received in return, rippled out into places he never saw. A man, a cat, and 2 wild cubs, strangers at first, then family. A legacy stitched together, not by biology or blood, but by something far stronger. Compassion, because sometimes the most unexpected family is the one that chooses each other. Walter didn't go looking for redemption, he just answered a cry in the dark. And in doing so, he didn't just help the tigers find their place in the world, he found his own.